I swear by God, the Almighty and All-Knowing, that what I am about to tell you is the pure truth. The final words of Friedrich Paulus have echoed through time, shocking historians, researchers, and even those closest to his story. His last confession was so unexpected and unsettling that it left people stunned, struggling to understand how such a revelation could have been carried almost to the grave by a man who once stood at the very heart of one of the most decisive battles of World War II. What he admitted in those final moments was not what anyone expected, and because of that, his last words have become one of the most talked about mysteries in modern history. Friedrich Paulus did not come from a background that suggested greatness or fame. He was born on September 23, 1890, in a small German town called Breitenau in Hesse. His father was a schoolteacher, a man who valued order, learning, and modest living. His mother came from a simple farming family, so together they raised Friedrich in a household that was disciplined, structured, and unpretentious. Nothing about this quiet upbringing hinted that one day he would play a role in one of the most devastating conflicts the world had ever seen. From his earliest years, Friedrich was not a boy of mischief or rebellion. Instead, he grew up serious, polite, and reserved. Those who knew him as a child remembered that he followed rules closely and had a personality marked more by caution than by boldness. He had a sharp eye for detail, and he preferred to do things carefully rather than rush into risks. There were no tales of wild adventures in his youth, no daring stunts, nothing to mark him as extraordinary. To his friends and neighbors, he was simply a quiet boy with good manners, someone who respected authority, but no one imagined him as a future general or a man who would eventually find himself standing against Adolf Hitler. In fact, young Friedrich's ambitions were not aimed at the army at all. His first dream was to join the Imperial German Navy. The thought of sailing on the open seas, serving with discipline aboard a ship, and living that structured maritime life fascinated him. But this dream was never realized. His health was considered too weak, and his family lacked the influence to push his application forward. At that time, in Germany, personal connections often played a large role in opportunities, and without strong family ties, Friedrich was quietly rejected from the naval path he longed for. It was a disappointment for him, but like many disappointments in life, it redirected him towards something else. That rejection became the reason he turned to the German army instead, which would ultimately shape his entire destiny. In 1910, when he was only 19 years old, Friedrich joined the German army. Unlike the sea life he had once dreamed of, the land-based army was not his first choice, but it provided him with a place where his natural discipline, attention to detail, and obedience to authority could thrive. Slowly, he began to rise through the ranks. He was not flashy or overly ambitious, but his careful, methodical way of thinking gained him respect. Officers noticed that he was precise, reliable, and serious in his duties. His career advanced steadily, and while he was not considered a military genius or an adventurous warrior, he was seen as someone dependable, someone who could be trusted with responsibility. When World War I broke out in 1914, Friedrich, like millions of young men across Europe, was pulled into the chaos. He served throughout the war, experiencing the brutality and hardship that defined those years. While many men were broken by the horrors of trench warfare, Friedrich endured quietly. He was not the kind of soldier to seek glory, but he did his duty with a sense of order and discipline. By the end of the war in 1918, Germany faced defeat, and its people were left disillusioned and angry. For Friedrich, the war years gave him more than just experience, they also gave him a career that would continue into the new era of Germany that was about to rise from the ashes of defeat. The years following World War I were turbulent. Germany faced political unrest, economic crisis, and the rise of radical movements, including the one led by Adolf Hitler. Friedrich continued to serve in the army, slowly rising in responsibility. His cautious nature, which once made him seem too quiet for leadership, now made him valuable in a time when recklessness could destroy careers. Step by step, he moved forward, and by the time World War II erupted in 1939, he was a respected officer. But it was during World War II that Friedrich Paulus would be thrust into a position that would forever define his life and his legacy. He became best known for his role in the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the most brutal and decisive battles in history. Leading the German Sixth Army, Paulus found himself at the center of a massive struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The battle lasted months, with unimaginable losses on both sides. As the fighting dragged on through the bitter Russian winter, German troops starved, froze, and suffered under constant Soviet attacks. Eventually, surrounded and cut off from supplies, Paulus faced an impossible choice: obey Hitler's orders to fight to the last man or surrender to save what remained of his army. In January 1943, against Hitler's wishes, Paulus surrendered. It was the first time a German field marshal had ever been captured alive, as Hitler had expected him to either fight to the end or take his own life rather than face defeat. For this, Hitler despised him, seeing him as a traitor, but for the soldiers under Paulus's command, surrender was the only way to survive. After his capture, Paulus spent years in Soviet custody, eventually testifying against the Nazi regime during the Nuremberg trials. His decision and his survival made him one of the most controversial figures of the war. And yet, for all that history recorded about him, it was his final confession before his death that stunned the world most of all. Those who heard it were left speechless, for it was not about glory, not about strategy, and not about the politics of the time. Instead, it was a deeply human admission, something that revealed the heavy weight he had carried throughout his life. Historians who studied him never expected such words to come from his lips, and even researchers who had followed his life story closely were unprepared. He revealed something that turned many assumptions upside down, something that reminded the world that behind every general, behind every leader of war, there is still a man burdened with doubts, regrets, and unspoken truths. This is why Friedrich Paulus's story continues to fascinate people today. He was not born a soldier, nor did he chase power with ambition. He was simply a man of discipline who found himself swept into the storm of history. From a quiet childhood in a small German town to the horrors of Stalingrad and finally to his shocking last words, his life serves as a reminder that history is not just made of dates and battles but also of individuals who carried their struggles to the very end. Friedrich began his military career in 1910 when he was placed in the 111th Infantry Regiment as an officer cadet. It was here that his life as a soldier truly started, surrounded by strict order, endless drills, and a demand for precision in every task. Friedrich was not the kind of man who fit the image of a bold and fearless warrior. He was not loud or daring on the battlefield. Instead, he was quiet, observant, steady, and reliable. These traits, while less glamorous, made him perfectly suited for staff work, where careful planning, organization, and logistics often mattered as much as direct courage under fire. When World War I erupted in 1914, it became the ultimate test for millions of soldiers across Europe. Many young officers built their reputations by charging through the trenches, leading their men in reckless bravery, but Friedrich's role was different. Instead of leading assaults, he was placed in positions that demanded order and organization. He was responsible for operations, supplies, and staff duties, ensuring that men had what they needed to survive in the chaos of war. To outsiders, this kind of work might have seemed unremarkable, even dull compared to the glory of frontline combat. Yet, those who worked with him quickly saw his value. In a war where chaos reigned, having someone who could maintain structure and precision often meant the difference between disaster and survival. His superiors noted his ability to pay attention to the smallest details, and it became clear that while he was not a fiery leader, he was the kind of officer armies could rely on when everything else was falling apart. Outside of the battlefield, Friedrich's personal life also began to take shape. During these years, he met and married Elena Rosetti-Salescu, a Romanian woman from a noble family. This marriage was significant for many reasons. Elena was not only known for her grace and inner strength, but she also brought Friedrich into social circles far above his own modest background. Through her, he was connected to the aristocracy of another country, something that gave him a broader perspective and an elevated status. More importantly, their marriage gave Friedrich the stability and emotional support that he needed throughout the long and difficult years of his career. Their relationship remained strong and steady, even as war and duty constantly pulled him into hardship. When the First World War finally ended in 1918, Germany was left in ruins. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing conditions that stripped the nation of much of its military power. The once proud German army was reduced to a mere 100,000 men under what was now called the Reichswehr. Many officers lost their positions as the military was downsized, and countless soldiers were dismissed back into civilian life. But Friedrich managed to remain. Once again, his steady reliability, discipline, and quiet obedience allowed him to hold on to a role in the army even when so many others were forced to leave. The years that followed, during the Weimar Republic, were marked by political instability, economic crises, and social unrest. Germany was a country in turmoil, with shifting governments and radical movements constantly battling for power. In this environment, Friedrich's calm, disciplined personality became an asset. He did not involve himself in political struggles, nor did he seek attention. Instead, he quietly continued to do his duty, climbing the military ranks step by step. He was not a man who commanded attention through charisma or loud speeches. He was not the kind of officer who inspired men with dramatic gestures. But in a time when loyalty and steadiness were rare, his dependable nature made him stand out in its own way. By the 1930s, as Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power, Friedrich had established himself as a trusted and capable officer. Once again, he avoided politics, choosing instead to focus on his career as a military planner and organizer. Unlike many of the flamboyant generals who craved recognition, Friedrich did not chase after personal glory. He was not one to push himself forward or take unnecessary risks to win fame. Instead, he became known for his skills and careful planning. He could map out troop movements with accuracy, calculate supply needs with precision, and anticipate logistical challenges before they became problems. These qualities made him invaluable to the German military as it began to expand and prepare for new wars. Yet these same traits also revealed his limits. Friedrich was cautious, obedient, and methodical, but he lacked boldness and independent daring. He was a man shaped entirely by discipline and duty, someone who preferred to follow orders rather than challenge them. From his quiet upbringing to his steady rise through the army ranks, his life seemed to form a clear pattern. He was the careful officer who did his job without fanfare, without rebellion, and without seeking to stand out. This personality would serve him well in building trust with his superiors, but it would also put him in an impossible position later, when he would be forced to choose between obedience to Adolf Hitler and the survival of his men. History was preparing to place Friedrich Paulus in a position where obedience would no longer mean honor but destruction. When he first entered the German army in 1910, he stepped into a world still deeply shaped by tradition, discipline, and strict hierarchy. The Imperial Army carried centuries of proud Prussian precision, and for someone like Friedrich, who valued order and structure above everything else, it was a natural fit. Still, even in this environment, he was not the kind of man who stood out for loud commands or fiery speeches. Instead, he earned respect quietly by being diligent, dependable, and committed to following procedures to the letter. He became known as the sort of officer who might not inspire men with passion but who could be trusted to keep things running correctly. By the time the First World War broke out in 1914, Friedrich had already gained experience as a junior officer. The war transformed Germany overnight, and the entire army was mobilized for a conflict unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Many young officers longed to be at the front lines, hoping to prove their courage in direct combat. Friedrich's path was different. He was placed in staff roles, where his responsibilities centered on planning, supplies, and troop movements. To outsiders, this may not have looked heroic, but in truth, wars depend as much on logistics as they do on bravery. Armies collapse without food, weapons, and organization, and it was in these areas that Friedrich quietly showed his worth. In the middle of chaos, his calm nature and sharp eye for detail set him apart. He was not reckless, nor did he take unnecessary risks, but his superiors noticed his ability to manage complex operations with precision. While he never became a celebrated battlefield commander during the war, he was considered reliable, a man who could be trusted to keep order when everything around him seemed to fall apart. Some of his fellow officers described him as reserved, perhaps even stiff, but in an army where many chased personal glory, his steadiness gave him a unique position. He was not the kind of man who attracted attention, but he was the kind who could keep an army functioning when others faltered. When the war ended in 1918, Germany was left broken and humiliated. The Treaty of Versailles slashed the size of the military to just 100,000 men, stripped away vast territories, and placed crushing financial burdens on the nation. Many officers lost their careers overnight as the once powerful German army was reduced to a fraction of its former size. Yet Friedrich managed to remain. His reliability and disciplined character once again proved valuable, allowing him to keep his place when so many others were dismissed. Through the 1920s, he served quietly in staff positions, far from the dramatic headlines of history. These years were not defined by bold battles or sudden promotions but by slow, steady progress. He attended military schools, studied organization and strategy, and refined his skills in logistics. In many ways, it seemed as though his career would remain that of a middle-ranking officer, respectable, yes, but not remarkable. He was viewed as careful, dependable, and loyal, but not as someone destined for dramatic achievements. Still, this quiet period was shaping him for the role history would eventually demand of him. The traits that defined Friedrich Paulus, caution, attention to detail, and discipline, were slowly shaping him into the kind of officer who could be trusted with greater responsibilities. During the difficult years between the two world wars, one thing stood out above all: his cautious personality. While many officers openly criticized the political chaos of the Weimar Republic or quickly threw their support behind Adolf Hitler's rising movement, Friedrich kept his distance. He did not dive into politics, nor did he try to tie himself to any ideology. He was a soldier and nothing more. His focus was on duty, on the army, and on the tasks before him. In hindsight, this neutrality actually protected him. He was never seen as too connected to the old imperial guard, nor was he viewed as a political opportunist. Instead, he came across as a professional officer, a quality that became increasingly valuable as the Nazi Party gained power. Colleagues often noted that Friedrich lacked the flair or charisma of men like Erwin Rommel or Heinz Guderian. He was not a visionary, and he rarely offered bold or daring proposals. What he did possess, however, was an unshakable sense of duty. If he received an order, he followed it precisely. If asked to plan the movement of entire divisions across hundreds of miles, he could do so with meticulous accuracy. To superiors who valued obedience, precision, and dependability, Friedrich Paulus was the ideal officer. As the 1930s progressed and Hitler consolidated his grip on Germany, the army began to secretly rebuild, violating the restrictions set by the Treaty of Versailles. The small Reichswehr expanded into the Wehrmacht, and officers who had endured years of slow progress suddenly found themselves rising quickly through the ranks. Friedrich was among them. His decades of quiet service and careful work finally began to pay off. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Friedrich Paulus was still largely unknown outside military circles. He was a career officer who had built his reputation on patience, staff work, and organization, not on dramatic victories. Yet war has a way of propelling certain men forward, sometimes faster than they ever imagined. The rapid expansion of Germany's war machine created opportunities that would thrust him into positions of authority he could not have foreseen in the quiet years of the Weimar Republic. At the start of the war, Paulus served under senior generals, mainly in planning and organizational roles. He coordinated the movements of soldiers, tanks, and supplies across vast distances. These were not glamorous responsibilities, but they were vital to Germany's early successes. His superiors began to recognize that Paulus had a rare gift for turning ambitious strategies into practical, workable plans. In 1940, during the invasion of France, Paulus worked as a senior staff officer under General Gerd von Rundstedt. The campaign turned out to be one of Germany's greatest early victories, with France defeated in just 6 weeks. For Paulus, the experience reinforced his reputation as a precise and dependable planner. While generals on the front pages of newspapers were celebrated as heroes, Paulus remained in the background, his name known mainly to insiders. The next major step in his career came when he was appointed Deputy Chief of Staff of the German Army. This was a major achievement, placing him close to some of the most powerful and influential generals of the time. Still, Paulus did not change his style. He remained reserved, careful, and deferential. He was not the type to challenge his superiors with strong objections, nor did he push back against orders. This habit of obedience, which had served him well for so many years, would later prove critical, because it shaped the way he responded to Adolf Hitler's increasingly inflexible commands. By 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. It became the largest military campaign in history, with millions of German and Axis soldiers crossing the Soviet border. Friedrich played an important role in the early planning stages. He worked with others to organize the vast logistics needed to move armies hundreds of miles across the enormous Soviet landscape. At first, the campaign seemed to succeed, as German forces advanced rapidly. But soon, the challenges of fighting in such a huge territory became obvious. Supply lines grew overstretched, resources ran short, and the swift victory Hitler had promised never came. It was during these difficult months that Friedrich started to gain more attention. His calm approach and ability to handle complex planning made him stand out to his superiors. In 1942, he was promoted to general and given command of the Sixth Army, one of Germany's most powerful fighting forces. This was no small promotion. The Sixth Army had over 250,000 soldiers, with tanks, artillery, and vast equipment under its control. For Friedrich, who had spent most of his career in planning and staff roles, this was a dramatic change. Now he had to lead one of the largest field armies in direct combat. Hitler trusted him precisely because he was obedient and unlikely to challenge orders. The mission given to the Sixth Army in 1942 was ambitious: advance deep into Soviet territory and capture the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Stalingrad was not only a key strategic position but also carried huge symbolic value, since it bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Hitler believed that conquering the city would deal a devastating blow to Soviet morale. For Friedrich, this was the greatest test of his career. He was now responsible for hundreds of thousands of lives and one of the most critical operations of the war. At first, things went according to plan. The Sixth Army moved forward with speed, breaking through Soviet defenses and pushing steadily toward Stalingrad. By summer 1942, German troops were closing in on the city. Yet the deeper they advanced, the more strained their supply system became. Food, ammunition, and fuel grew harder to deliver across the long distances. At the same time, Soviet resistance stiffened. Reinforcements arrived, and the Red Army was determined to defend Stalingrad at any cost. What was supposed to be a quick campaign was turning into a grinding battle. When fighting reached the city itself, the war took on a new character. The Sixth Army plunged into one of the most brutal urban battles in history. Every block, every factory, every apartment building became a battlefield. German forces advanced street by street, but Soviet defenders fought with incredible determination. Soldiers and even civilians turned ruins into strongholds, refusing to give ground. Progress was slow and costly. Meanwhile, the Sixth Army was wearing down. Months of fighting drained the soldiers. Supplies were collapsing, ammunition was short, food rations were meager, and winter was setting in with bitter cold. On top of this, the German flanks around Stalingrad were held not by elite forces but by Romania, Hungary, and Italy's poorly equipped divisions. These allies were already exhausted, undertrained, and demoralized. To any careful strategist, it was clear the Germans were in a dangerous position. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a massive counterattack, Operation Uranus. They struck precisely at the weak Axis allies guarding the flanks. The Soviet assault was overwhelming. Within days, the Romanian and Hungarian lines collapsed, and the Soviet armies encircled the entire Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. More than 250,000 men of the Sixth Army were now trapped inside a tightening Soviet encirclement. At that point, the German High Command faced a critical decision. The army still had enough mobility, vehicles, and fuel to attempt a breakout, and such a move could have saved a large part of the force. But Hitler, sitting in his headquarters far from the front, refused to allow it. Instead, he ordered Friedrich to hold Stalingrad at all costs, promising that supplies would be delivered by air. It was a promise that could never be kept. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, did not have the capacity to provide enough food, fuel, or ammunition to sustain an entire army. Even so, Friedrich, bound by his sense of duty and habit of obedience, followed Hitler's command. He could see the suffering of his soldiers, but he hesitated to openly defy orders. As weeks passed, the conditions inside Stalingrad became nightmarish. Food ran out, leaving men starving. The harsh winter froze them, and frostbite spread quickly. Ammunition dwindled until soldiers were counting every bullet. Many wrapped themselves in rags for warmth, while wounded men often went untreated because medical supplies were gone. Despite all this, Hitler continued to demand that the Sixth Army stay and fight. Some of Friedrich's own generals urged him to act differently. Walter von Seydlitz and others pressed him to order a breakout while there was still a chance. They argued that disobedience was the only way to save what remained of the army. Others insisted that surrender was the only option left to prevent further pointless deaths. But Friedrich, cautious and deeply loyal, refused to take independent action. He stuck to his role as an obedient commander, and for weeks the Sixth Army withered inside the Soviet trap. By January 1943, the situation was beyond saving. The Soviets launched their final assault, and the remaining German defenses collapsed. In those last desperate days, Hitler promoted Friedrich to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army. No field marshal in German history had ever been captured alive. The promotion carried a grim message: Hitler expected him to commit suicide rather than surrender. But Friedrich made a different choice. When Soviet troops reached his headquarters on January 31, 1943, he surrendered. For the first time in history, a German field marshal was taken alive. In captivity, Friedrich's outlook began to change. Together with officers like Seydlitz, he joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, an anti-Nazi group formed by prisoners of war. He publicly called on German commanders to lay down their arms, declaring that continued loyalty to Hitler would only bring more destruction and needless death. After the war, Friedrich remained in Soviet custody for many years. He was not released until the mid-1950s. Eventually, he was allowed to settle in East Germany, where the communist government presented him as a symbol, a general who had broken with Hitler and spoken out against Nazism. He appeared in interviews and at official events, always careful to distance himself from the regime he had once served. But behind the public appearances was a man weighed down by memory. He carried the burden of having commanded the doomed Sixth Army at Stalingrad, where hundreds of thousands of his men perished. By 1957, Friedrich's health had sharply declined. The years of war, captivity, and regret had left him a shadow of the commander he once was. Years of captivity, stress, and the burden of age had left Friedrich weak and frail. Eventually, he was taken to a hospital in Dresden, where doctors tried to help him, but it was clear that his health was failing. The man who had once commanded one of the largest battles of the war now lay in a simple bed, thin from illness, dressed in a hospital gown, often relying on an oxygen mask to breathe. It was in this quiet and clinical setting that his final reflections came to light. His last words before death shocked those around him. Friedrich admitted what he had kept hidden for years. "I can't keep this inside anymore," he said. "I had no intention of shooting myself for that Bohemian corporal," a sharp reference to Hitler. Nurses and visitors who saw him in those final days remembered him as calm, reserved, and thoughtful. He was not a man of sudden outbursts, even as his strength faded. Though his body was failing, his mind stayed sharp, and he remained firm about one thing: he was a Roman Catholic. Suicide, for him, was unthinkable. Years earlier, when Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal at Stalingrad, the expectation had been clear. German tradition demanded that a man of such rank would never allow himself to be captured alive. But Friedrich had refused. Even in the desperate last days of Stalingrad, he told his men not to throw away their lives recklessly. He ordered them not to expose themselves unnecessarily or stand up in trenches simply to be shot. He valued life, even when war tried to strip it away. In February 1957, Friedrich Paulus passed away in Dresden at the age of 66. His final words lingered long after his body was laid to rest. They were the words of a man who at last admitted what obedience and loyalty had once forced him to hide. The response to his death was deeply divided. In East Germany, where he had spent his final years, the communist government portrayed him as a redeemed figure, a man who had broken with Hitler and chosen a new anti-fascist path. His funeral was organized with care, filled with symbols of state approval. Photographs from the time show military officials, wreaths, and speeches that praised him as a general who had rejected Nazism. But in West Germany, the reaction was very different. There, many saw him not as a hero, but as a controversial and even failed commander. Veterans who had fought and suffered at Stalingrad accused him of cowardice, saying he had not done enough to save his men when retreat might still have been possible. Despite the divide, both East and West Germany recognized one undeniable fact: his story was unlike that of any other German officer. He was the only field marshal captured alive, and his surrender at Stalingrad had marked a turning point in the Second World War. In the years that followed, his final words became the subject of heated debate. In East Germany, they were used as proof that even the highest-ranking generals could repent. School textbooks and political speeches quoted him, highlighting his rejection of Hitler while quietly ignoring the many years he had loyally served the Reich. In West Germany, however, his legacy was treated with more suspicion. Survivors of Stalingrad gave their own accounts. Some described him as distant, a man who clung to duty even when it meant disaster. Others recalled moments when he had tried to spare unnecessary deaths, forbidding reckless sacrifice when all hope was gone. Historians have continued to wrestle with his story. Some argue that he represents the dangers of a military culture built on blind obedience, where discipline without moral judgment leads to tragedy. Others see him as a tragic figure, a man who only realized too late that loyalty to a corrupt leader is not a virtue but a curse. His final confession does not erase his mistakes, but it forces us to see him as a human being, flawed, conflicted, and painfully aware of the choices he had made. Friedrich Paulus was neither a monster nor a martyr. He was a man caught between loyalty and conscience, who admitted at the end of his life that he had chosen wrongly. His words still resonate today because they speak to a larger truth: the danger of following orders blindly and mistaking obedience for honor. More than 6 decades after his death, Friedrich Paulus remains a divisive figure. His name will always be tied to Stalingrad, the battle that turned the tide of the Second World War and sealed the fate of Nazi Germany. His story continues to raise uncomfortable questions, not only about him, but about the cost of obedience, the meaning of duty, and the price of silence.